Good afternoon. We're back for a discussion. My name is Joey Livingston, and this is Dr. Jones, and we're going to talk to you about a few things this morning or this afternoon regarding, first of all, the teaching this morning. You said some things, asked some questions that got a lot of people thinking, a lot of people talking. We discussed the alleged words of Jesus, where he told the people that he was speaking to at the time that if they didn't hate their mother and their father and their brothers and sisters and even themselves on account of him, that they weren't worthy to follow him. And we went back into the Old Testament and looked at some examples where God said that he hated, where he said, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated, etc. And all these things, all these downer type things, you know, and then you kind of left us with a cliffhanger. You said that Jesus didn't say those things. We went and talked about Paul. You didn't say whether he said those things or not. But I wanted to ask you about those words that Jesus said. If you don't love your mother and father, or if you don't hate your mother and father, your brothers, your sisters, your own life on account of me, you're not worthy to follow me. If he didn't say that, then what did he actually say?
One of the things that we suffer from understanding the language that Jesus spoke. Jesus didn't speak Greek, and these disciples were taking down notes in Greek. That didn't happen. The thing that we have to understand about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these are books that are put together well after the resurrection. These are not books that are put together while these individual authors are walking with these people, or even Jesus. And we have to understand also that when we read the accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that these Gospels sound strange. And I'm not talking about just sounding strange. They are strange. When you read them from the Greek text and you read them from the meta-language that we have that we call a Bible. A meta-language is simply one language speaking about another in a sense. But we're talking about not just meta-language, but we're talking about the meta-language of theology. We're talking about church gloss. Church gloss that has been utilized to satisfy Jesus' terms in a sense. When Jesus spoke, they did not write down what he was saying. This had to do with a fulfillment of what is stated in John chapter 14 and John chapter 16. John 14 and also 16 state that when Jesus was talking, and I'm paraphrasing, and by the way, a paraphrase is normally much better in transport, that is, of the Greek text to the English ear or mind, than a form-critical translation. A form-critical translation concentrates on ideas like, let's take and satisfy every participle in English, let's satisfy every participle that we have in Greek with a participle in English. And so what these translators who have translated have attempted to do is to take form-critical methods of transport, and they've tried to satisfy form for form. And they've tried to make the English text read like the Greek text. In other words, they've augmented it in such a manner that they've tried to replicate a lot of syntactical features. They've tried to replicate, in a sense, a rhyme and a reason for certain kinds of gloss. And please understand that our translations did not start at a period of time in which there was a lot of knowledge concerning the Greek text. The kind of Greek that's spoken in Matthew or utilized in the book of Matthew really was foreign to people, extremely foreign to people. It was a language that church people didn't even care to hold on to. They didn't preserve the language, they actually lost the language. They didn't just lose the language, but they lost the document that Matthew wrote. Not only did they lose the document that Matthew wrote, they lost all subsequent writings concerning Jesus, that is, his words, in any kind of Aramaic, because mostly he would speak Aramaic, and this is very, 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 very obvious. And so when one is walking with an individual and you do not account for his words verbatim, and you wait until after the resurrection, way after the resurrection, to even account or collect the words and put these phrases, these terms together, much can be changed, and much did change. But when I say something about John chapter 14 to John chapter 16, Jesus was speaking to them, and I paraphrase. He's simply saying, you can't handle, you can't grasp what I'm saying now. And so if Jesus is stating while he is walking with them, I mean, let's read it. Let's read this. Let's go to John chapter, I need a piece of paper to mark this. That would be John chapter 14. And let's look at verse 25. And most of the time, church people don't care to keep this in context, but suffice it to say, let's read it anyhow. These things I have spoken unto you. This is chapter 14, verse 25. Let's read from the King James Bible. These things have I spoken unto you, being yet present with you. So, according to King James theology, and the reason that I emphasize King James theology, it's because the King James translators were not using a legitimate form of Greek when they translated from the Textus Receptus, and they had the third edition of the Textus Receptus. They were not using a legitimate form or pattern or paradigm of that language. The language was still under construction. It was lost. It needed to be resurrected, and it was resurrected, and then it needed to be reconstructed. And when the King James translators translated from the Textus Receptus, it would be similar to you moving into a house before it's built or finished, I should say. It would be like the people who pour the slabs. When they pour the slab, you move in before the stud walls go up and the rafters go up and the sheathing, the decking, whatever you want to call it, and then the shingles and then the sheetrock inside, plumbing, wiring, all of that. If you move in premature, you're not going to really enjoy the full, the entire facility. And so this is much like what the King James translators were forced to do before they could even wrap their minds around Greek. And please understand, they were not dealing with any manuscripts. They were simply dealing with a text base called the Textus Receptus, put together in a very sleazy way, to be honest with you. Back translations from Latin into Greek, do you name it? I mean, it's just pitifully poor. These people, how they handled the idea of the language was extremely, extremely poor. And this is the reason that the King James Version is extremely inaccurate. It doesn't represent the Greek at all in most cases, much less the words of anyone. And so the argument needs to be made, first of all, that the King James translators really are not representing the Greek language of the first century. Now, we call it Koine, but they didn't call it Koine in the first century. And a lot of people are trying to argue, well, it was Koine Greek. No, it was not Koine Greek in the first century. It was just known as Greek. And we love using labels, and so we've labeled this just to speak about it. But people need to understand that this was a melting pot of Greek. You have lots of Attic, a little bit of Doric, Ionic. You've got several kinds of Greek. You have language flux. It's up and down. It's not a simple thing.
And was it called Attic, Doric, and Ionic back then?
No. I mean, those are the kinds of Greek that we refer to as classical Greek. And yes, people did label that. But when Alexander the Great came into the scene, he is the one that we should applaud in this context to say, someone was wrapping their mind around the concept of a universal language. And so Greek became a universal language, and it became a melting pot for how people could utilize something in a very simple way. It's much like English. And so we've had three of them. We've had, Greek, and then we've also had Latin, and then we've had now English.
Right.
And so just as much as we have, for instance, with the ideas, I had some person on Facebook, this person was making the argument that words can't have opposite meanings. And so I simply made a post, and I simply said, well, it was just kind of strange that you would say so. I said, has bad ever been used for good? And the person replied back and said, wow, that's slang. That's not authentic language. And, that's really pitiful because, these people who put together lexicons, what they're doing is putting together semantic domain fields. And these semantic domain fields are rich with all kinds of metaphor. And so whether it's one usage or multiple usages, and people use the word bad all the time for good on records, CDs and music. They do this in books, magazines, even television shows, movies. It's a very popular thing. We can call it slang all we want to, and we can say, oh, there is only a proper language utilized. But we're talking about a language that was extremely barbaric, to say the least, when you go back centuries ago.
Yeah.
And so for people to even come up with these concepts that these kinds of ideas were not even put together. And I really cautioned this person. I said, the problem is fundamentally is that Christians have boxed up some gloss.
Right.
And they don't want to move on this.
Right.
And that's unfortunate. And they did this not 3 or 4 days ago. They did this years ago when they put their theology together. They simply, it was like a little cereal box of some sort.
Yeah.
They put a gloss system together.
One word that comes to mind that certainly isn't slang is the word incredible. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a time when that word was, if you use that word towards something, you weren't complimenting it. You were saying that your statement lacks credibility. That is an incredible statement.
I think that anyone who is English rich knows that if you communicate with someone in the UK, for instance, and then you communicate with someone here in excellent English, that words go left and right all the time. If a person takes Greek in any seminary, they're going to find that the term luo, a very, very simple word, that's probably one of the most used words in all of Greek. Either it means or it doesn't mean anything until it has usage, but in most usages, and you have two categories that it falls into when it comes to this particular idea of a semantic domain field, the idea of loosing or the idea of destroying. That's how most people were using it. And so speaking from a diachronical standpoint, how it has been used throughout a given period of time, people were using luo for I loose or I destroy. And so the question would be, that's quite a distance. Yeah, it's a range. And I'm simply saying there are opposites, there are extremes. For instance, Elohim is an extreme. When you talk about human judges as opposed to God, I mean, we're talking about a human being in juxtaposition with God himself. You're talking about extremes. I mean, you can't get any more extreme than that. And you're talking about a plural concept of a singular idea. I mean, that is really, really pushing some weight there. Mm-hmm. And so I'm simply saying that we've got a long way to go in Reconstruction, and we have too many people who are extremely zealous. And when Jesus was speaking, and I'm not suggesting that what I'm about to say is what Jesus said, and this causes a lot of people a lot of problems, because I think that most people have in their idea, well, if I don't know Greek or if I don't know Hebrew, First and Second Temple Hebrew and Aramaic, and if I'm not a linguist, I probably can't know. I think that Paul is quite right in Ephesians chapter 4 when he makes the argument that God gave gifts, and these gifts are to equip people, and these gifts are actually people
themselves.
Yeah, and so if we have gifts, namely people who actually equip people, did God ever intend for the Bible to become a self-help book? Or did he ever intend for it to be collated and called the Bible?
Right. I mean, we've only had the illusion of having some sort of reference manual, some sort of user guide to God for the past, even 1,000 years. That may be an extreme even there, because there was a time when the Catholic Church withheld even that from the people, from people having it themselves.
Well, the canonizational process.
But prior to that, the people who existed during Paul's day, Paul was telling them, take those documents that you had, that the Jews are spouting as God's infallible word, and you can read it, but don't, this is not some user guide to God. Put it over here. There's nothing good about this when it comes to defining who God is. So, I mean, you talk about people without and I keep using this term user manual because people somehow feel like the Bible is a user manual to defining who God is. But that's I don't think that was the intended use.
Well, the canonical process was not started in 357. It's give or take left or right of that. We can argue that, we finally had a settling of one particular kind of canon. There are various canons, and still to this day we have people who would argue that we need a better canon, and I would be in that group. The canon that we have is extremely poor. It wasn't put together by facts. It wasn't put together by that kind of structure. It's not a system of proof, and you know that God said X, Y, and Z. It's simply a bunch of people who got together in the name of God, just like people did when they got together in the name of God and went and committed infanticide. And so if you can picture a mob, if you will, simply going after the killing of all kinds of people in calling it, in the name of God, we kill all these people, man, woman, child, infant. We will even cut their bellies open and dash their babies up against the rock. That's what we find in Scripture. And so this should alarm us. It's very much like mob activity.
Sure.
And so when you study even the church fathers, is very much mob activity. And so mob-like theology is what it is.
By mob, do you mean mafia?
No. I think that, you know, I'm not complimenting the mafia, but I think that the mafia is, they are going to think about what they're doing. Much unlike the church did. They were not thinking. They were very much like Peter, you know, willing to jump out and try to do anything. You know, he's walking with Jesus, hearing teachings about this incredible love that he has, and he's willing to cut the guy's ear off. I mean, come on, or head off, I should say.
Yeah,
I'm simply saying that Jesus indicates to them, once again, don't go too far with this. These things have I spoken unto you, being yet present with you. So Jesus claims to be physiologically with them, according to this book of John. It's better not to say that this is God's word. We should say that this is John's account. And so when we read verse 26, but the Comforter, which is the Holy Ghost, and once again, the Holy Ghost is used because these guys had an idea. And I'm talking about the King James Bible translators, not King James Version. Version came as a result of when it arrived in the Western world, but the King James Bible translators actually had a conception of Greek like it was Holy Ghost, a Holy Ghost language. They call it Holy Ghost Greek. Pitiful. To say Holy Ghost is a very pitiful way of even recognizing what's even stated. Another time, another teaching, I guess. But the Comforter, which is the Holy Ghost, whom the Father will send in my name, he shall teach you all things and bring all things to your remembrance, whatever I've said unto you. And so what he's saying these things I have spoken to you, yada, yada, yada. Then he continues that you're going to be, what? You're going to have all this stuff. He shall teach you all things and bring all things to your remembrance, whatever I've said to you. Why is he stating that? In chapter 16, he makes a similar statement. In verse 12, he said, I have yet many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. You can't handle it right now. And he goes further, howbeit when he, the Spirit of truth, is come, he will guide you into all truth, for he shall not speak of himself, but whatsoever he shall hear, that shall he speak, and he will show you things to come. The point is, he's speaking to these people in their physiological presence. He's physically with them. And he's telling them, you can't handle what I really need to say to you. But that's never told, is it? You know, we're always told, oh yeah, they could handle it. They could understand it. But Jesus is telling them point blank, you can't handle, you can't grasp what is being told. Now, if John's confession is right, in John chapter 2, we find a major confession of the writer of this particular book. He makes this confession. He said, chapter 2, verse 22, after he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. So he's confessing to the actual premise that Jesus was working with before his death. And he makes the statement, after he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. So this indicates that John was not technically a believer when walking with Jesus, if John is accurate or right, or if this meta-language is accurate or right. And so when we look at, for instance, this book that we call Luke, and we start reading all about it, and I'm going to read from this volume here. In chapter 14, verse 25, now great crowds were traveling with him. So he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Wow. Now, what translators are attempting to do here, they're attempting to push their responsibility of what they know in the Greek text and know about all other components surrounding its context away. For instance, if you and I talk today about any given subject that we've been in the environment of, everyone else is going to be a foreigner to what we're talking about.
Sure.
Even though they may know English. But if they know the environment that we've been in, they will understand readily the referentials. And so in order to understand this text cannot be understood unless you, number one, you understand the language. And I'm simply saying that out of tradition, the church has built models of translation theory that are extremely synthetic. They're not workable. They're not even workable in this sense. They're not user-friendly. They are not transparent to people who are English-only readers. Now, this kind of language that Jesus is utilizing here is extremely elliptical. And when you are elliptical, in any sense of the word, it would be up to the person. For instance, if I wanted to share something with someone down the road, and you and I had this conversation, and this conversation had a lot of what we call ellipses in it, but it was understood. If I carried this information to someone down the road, and I only gave them a verbatim of what we actually said, would they be able to comprehend what we're talking about?
No.
Because in order for people to be able to grasp what someone is talking about, you have to have a system of referentials.
Sure.
And if you have a system of referentials, you have to have an entire context. And if translators are building upon a context and they know the referentials, this is not difficult in one sense of the word. The referentials are there. You can see them. You can see what's being referred to and all of that. The question would be, if you're a translator and you're speaking to people in English and they don't have the luxury that you have, that is to look at the referentials and see the referentials and deal with the referentials that Jesus was dealing with so they can understand the context, would it be a good idea as a translator simply to give an elliptical styled syntax to a bunch of English readers without leading them to those referentials? Would that be a good thing if you really wanted them to understand actually what Jesus said?
I mean, if Jesus is leaving things unsaid and it's necessary to understand his context, and we do a form critical translation and just leave these things unsaid, I mean, Matthew was writing to a particular group of people and expecting those people, they were his target, he was expecting them to understand what he was writing. He was not writing to us. And so for the translators to do something form critical and just, that's like pretending that we are Matthew's original target audience. It doesn't make any sense.
But, there are other models of translation theory. For instance, the dynamic equivalent is not, it's not the form critical. Its concentration mostly is in not giving you participle for participle. It's trying to give you meaning for meaning or structure for structure in that sense. But unfortunately, rather than giving you a context-to-context understanding, and you can't transport meaning from this point to that point without taking context. For instance, if I say up, I'm asking you to do some work for me. I've got this sentence in my head, and I've utilized the word up in it. Tell me what up means. You can't do so unless you know the context. And so unless you know the context of up, regardless of whether I tell you the sentence or not, if I tell you the sentence, you still can't get it unless you have the context. But if you have the context and if you have the sentence, you need to package that together for someone, for them to be able to understand. And my point is, if English readers want a translation model that doesn't allow for the idea of context, you really don't have what's called a legitimate translation. In other words, at least footnote something. Give people a clue as to what is going on. In other words, when English readers read, the tragic thing is translators need to say, this is an obvious metaphor, this is elliptical, this is X, Y, and Z. That's simple to do, but translators are not doing that. Therefore, English readers are left in the dark, and that's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, footnotes are a great idea, and for all the people watching our show, I would encourage you, as you're reading, you know, even I'm not saying that this is the answer. I'm not saying that this is, you know, will bring great revelation to you, but at least read the footnotes that are provided to you. When I was younger, I used to read the NIV all the time, and you know. I didn't read Greek or Hebrew like you do, so I was just reading the English that was provided to me. But I read the footnotes to the point of exasperation. I mean, there are so many footnotes in the NIV, and I'm sure you wouldn't think that they're enough, but I got tired of reading them, but I still kept reading them. And even just reading the footnotes, I found that I had more insight than the average Christian or believer. And that isn't a brag on myself. I'm saying here we have the NIV, which or whatever translation has footnotes, and people aren't even reading the footnotes that are provided. And so there's a failure on the part of translators, but you can't say that there's not a failure on the part of the reader as well, because most people don't even read the footnotes that are provided to them, you know, as poor as they might be.
Right. English extant English translations are extremely wooden.
Right.
They're awkward. They're clumsy. We like watching Jesus movies simply because it's comedy to us, because they normally have lots of King James quotes in them, and you can hear people utilizing these extremely wooden things. And so these guys who like to be actors, they can't express themselves because a wooden styled English will cripple someone. Sure. Unless it's intended comedy. Yeah. And so you will have Jesus or Matthew or whoever making different statements, and it becomes a laughing styled kind of movie, and it's fun to watch.
Sure.
It's comical because that's not the way that people talk.
Right.
The Bibles that we have today, that's not the way that people communicate at all. And that's poor, that is, of the translators to give us models like that. There's a new translation that will be on the market soon. It's called the Transparent English Version. I read bits and pieces of it the other day, and it really doesn't. I think the only group that it's going to impress would be those people who would argue for the keeping of the law. And it's sad. It's really pitiful. I'm simply saying that English readers need a better translation, but not just a better translation, but a better canon. But let's go back to the point of the question. Let me answer it directly. What did Jesus mean? Did he mean by what he said, is he saying that we need to hate our fathers and our mothers? Do we need to hate our wives? No. If you look at the Greek text, you're going to find a system tied together quite perfectly. You're going to see a system of referentials. Even though you have an elliptical kind of syntax, etc., you do have the referentials that are very much a pattern of something to where you can grasp what's going on. And what Jesus is saying, and if I might simply just paraphrase, Jesus is simply saying that we need to do what? We need to hate that which our father and our mother trust, that which our wives may trust, that which our children have trusted, because we're talking about an entire group of people that were wrapped up in a theological bias. And what he's talking about, he's not talking about hating people, and that's obvious in Greek. He's talking about hating a something. And that's powerful. That's a game changer for every English reader. He's not talking about hating individuals. He's talking about hating something. And there's a big difference between me hating a theology and hating you.
Right.
And so the perception in Greek from how Luke, Luke records this is actually, Jesus is telling these people, you must hate the things of your father. That is the baggage, the theology of your father.
You must hate the things that your father and your mother love. I mean, I know you're being a little more specific than I am, but I'm trying to grasp here. But I mean, what you're arguing for makes all the sense in the world when it comes to when he finally says, if you don't hate your own life, because he's talking to people who are steeped in Old Covenant religion, and that is their life.
Yeah.
And so I guess what you're saying here is that Jesus is saying, it's like Paul. He said, if there's anybody that can brag on their life as a Jew, it's me. And he just went on, and he said, but I count this for nothing.
Right. I'm not willing at this point to give out, exactly how I have translated this, but I'm willing to give out the gist of what's being stated. And Jesus is talking about hating the thing that the fathers and the mothers and the wives and the children and everybody else, brothers and sisters, are involved in. It's about the thing hated rather than the people themselves. And that's a game changer in this idea here. He can't say, love your neighbor and your enemy, and then hate your mother and your father, your wife.
Sure. It doesn't make sense for Jesus to say,
it's
you've heard it said, love your neighbors and hate your enemies, but I tell you to love your enemies.
But it can't be true that he's saying, listen, I'm trying to use a theological spin here. I want you to love me more than you love your father and your mother and even your wife.
Right.
I mean, that's an extremely selfish thing to request, number one. And so when in comparison to me, I want your love for me to be much greater than what you have for your own wife or your own children. That's sick.
Right.
What kind of father asks of his children, I want you to love me more than you do your mother or that's not something that you would ask if you're sane. And that's not the intention of the text. And there are lots of people who would, and the reason that they do this, they are out to defend God. And my point in teaching all the time is, if God says something that's messed up, let's simply deal with it and say, God's not perfect. I haven't found that God is not perfect, but just in case he is, I'm more than willing to deal with his imperfection.
Yeah,
if he is imperfect.
You're saying if God is imperfect, then let it be that. Don't try to craft. If God is imperfect, do not try to craft a God that's perfect. You're lying.
Right.
So if God says something that sounds messed up, don't allow your mind to say, no, God is perfect, so that can't be messed up. Therefore, let me change my philosophy and consider that to be perfect. What we need to do is take what is said and evaluate it, find out why it was said, find out where it came from, find out was this accurately passed on to me, etc. Examine all of the facets of it, and And if we conclude, yes, God really did say this, yes, God really did order entire nations to be slaughtered, and yes, God really did say, love your enemies, and yes, those really don't disagree with those really don't agree with one another, then yes, God is contradicting himself. And let that be. Be strong enough, be brave enough to face the truth of who God is. And what we have found, what you have found, and you have taught to us, is that these things that seem screwed up, that they have been passed down to us wrongly. In every example where I have found something that seems really messed up, why would God say this? You have never failed to show me how that translation has been corrupted, or that has been passed down wrong to us, or the person who wrote it was simply dead wrong. So what you do here at the New Covenant Group really shows me, and I think anybody who's watching this show, the value of using your brain.
That would be an understatement. One of the things that we have to look at and examine carefully throughout history, man has been defending God. It's like it happens all the time. They're defending God. And how do you defend God? You're simply making up all these stories. It's like legend. You keep defending one individual just over and over and over again, and all of a sudden that person grows to be larger than life. And this is called hyperbole.
Right.
That's why when we look at First and Second Temple Hebrew along with Aramaic, those are languages of hyperbole. In other words, these languages were built upon the premise of taking a theology, if you will, and defending God. And it was like this started out about this size, and then it kept growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. It reminds me of people who love to talk about the love of God. Sometimes it amazes me when I hear people talk about the love of God. People love talking about love, period. And people love to write about love. They love to, well, let me say this. They love to exaggerate love. They love to build love up and build it up and build it up and build it up. And sometimes I'm wondering if we are guilty of worshiping love. I don't think it's ever good to go beyond the reality of something.
Sure.
And so I'm convinced that when it comes to simple terms like love, God's love, I think that most people are making more out of it than what's there. And a lot of people would get upset at me if they heard what I just said. I love my wife, but if I exaggerate my love to her, she will know it.
Right.
In other words, if I say something about it that's really not there, she will know it. And that's not beneficial for my relationship to her. She's wonderful. I love her with all of my heart. But I can't exaggerate my love. I've got to be pure about how much I love her. And yes, my love is growing. My understanding of it is growing and all of that. And sometimes what we do as human beings, we exaggerate what we really have. And we don't need to do that. And so the thing that I love about my wife is she's extremely honest with me.
Right.
About her love towards me, about everything. And that's something that I have to deal with. And that is wonderful. That kind of honesty is great. And she has to deal with me. How much do we love each other? It's immeasurable. But we can't exaggerate it. In a song, sometimes songwriters do us a lot of harm because they love to exaggerate everything. And this is why people are having an extremely difficult time finding contentment. It's because some songwriter who doesn't know left or right
romanticized everything and made it into an unachievable reality, as if it was a reality.
It's such an exaggeration. Yeah. Love is this.
This is the nature of poetry and metaphor, though.
Exactly. And so when you have that kind of thing going on between the ears, you're never going to be satisfied. And so all of this that we see on television, etc., that's trying to define romance, love,
right.
and all of that, it's really not fair to the mind of a person who doesn't know anything about love.
I can appreciate your point, but I believe that there's one exception in which you can be satisfied when these singers and these poets do what they do, and that is when you realize where they're coming from. I'm not saying that all poetry and all songs are perfect, but poetry and metaphor, they take the simple things of life and they nuance them. And so if you understand that for instance, my love for my wife is just as amazing as, or possibly even more amazing than that songwriter's love for his wife, but he's so inspired by it, and he has such a gift with poetry that he's saying all these things that nuance it. I can do that too. My love is amazing, and I can nuance it. But there's a difference between nuancing and lying. Does that make sense?
I completely agree, because any time that you nuance, for instance, I think a good idea of nuancing would be simply to take a picture that's unclear and bring clarity to it. That kind of nuancing is beneficial. Whereas in language, when we are going in the direction of what we call entropy, the language is failing. It's at that point that nuance fails. And so sometimes our language is ascending, that is, towards the idea of clarity.
Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful in linguistics.
Yeah.
Things are becoming much clearer.
Yeah.
But sometimes
you push it too far. You begin to nuance the nuance.
Exactly. Sometimes our language starts diving.
It's like when you're trying to
it gets confused.
Embellish the color of a photo to bring out all the beauty of it, and you take it too far, and all of a sudden the skin is orange and the leaves are neon green, and your eyes have adjusted to the point where that seems normal to you, but then somebody else walks up behind you and says, "What's wrong with your picture?"
There you go. And then the saturation level goes way up. And so in entropy, you have something in a downward flight, so to speak, and then someone nuances and it just shoves it deeper.
Sure.
And so it becomes unclear, even though the colors may be a bit more magnificent, but it becomes very synthetic.
Right.
And when I say synthetic, it's not really there. And that's what has happened. We've had people who have been defending God, and they've tried to mess with the language flux of how language works, and it's always been in this downward cycle of how language goes up and down when it comes to, the ideas of entropy and not, and we get confused.
Listen, we're getting close to our technical time limit here, and we can go further, etc. But I've
got a question, by the way.
You do? Well, yeah. I have Roy Montalbano, a regular viewer, sent in a question that's related to this morning's teaching, and I wanted to get it in here. And if you have time to answer it, fine. If we need to carry it over into the next session, fine. But did you want to ask your question first?
Let me hear that question and see if I have enough time for it.
Okay. All right.
Because you have me on this this time clock.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can't be off our time clock. But anyways, you kind of touched on this a little bit actually earlier. He said, Doc. He's calling you Doc now. He must think that he's on personal terms with you. No,
he needs to feel that way. The thing that I'm complimented with, and I take that very personal, in a very wonderful way. I like for people to let their hair down and become real.
Yeah, I do too.
A lot of people say Dr. Jones, and then they get closer to me and they say Doc, and it's heartfelt, and I enjoy that. That's what people even do at the bowling alley. I'm out there throwing. Instead of saying Dr. Jones, they say Doc. And so it's wonderful. That's touching.
So he says, Doc, I did get to hear your teaching this morning on Romans 9. I understand where you're coming from with the "this is insane" position. But how is the average Christian who is reading the Old and New Testament in English from whatever Bible translation, supposed to understand the Scriptures as a whole when they do not know the original languages of the Bible as you do? How does the average Christian know that, quote unquote, God is love, 1 John 4:8, that this is correct, but, quote unquote, God hated Esau or loved him less is incorrect? So how's the average Christian supposed to know that God is love is right, is true, but God hated Esau is not?
I think that Paul has the answer here. I'm really impressed with his paradigm, his model, if you will. In Ephesians chapter 4, we find a beautiful example of something that we've taught on many times. Let me turn there. In chapter 4, it was he who gave some to be apostles. That's not really something that we want. That's something that we run from.
Right.
And so when you look at this chapter 4, and I think Roy's asking a wonderful, wonderful question. I'm an English-only reader, and I need to be able to grasp what's the difference between the legitimate love of God and what's spurious. You know, I appreciate that. This is what, you know, my wife and I do all the time. We want the real love. That is in our relationship.
That's what we were just talking
we
about.
do not want the fallacious ideas.
Yeah, the embellished or the
exactly.
deceptive.
We want that which is real. And so when we read this, it was he, namely Jesus, who gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, and some to be actually shepherds who teach, to prepare God's people. Let's just, for the sake of argument, let's just breathe in for a moment. God gave gifts. This is God. This is the God who spoke directly to Paul. Not an angel, but this is God. This is Jesus. He speaks to the Apostle Paul and said, I gave gifts. And these gifts, let's read what they do. They prepare God's people.
Right.
I don't find that God gives a book to prepare God's people, but I find that God gives people to prepare other people. Right. Now, I'm not suggesting that I can't prepare you, or the apostles can't prepare us with, a written information. They can certainly do it in written form or in oral form, but you can do it in both ways on video.
Right.
So, if I'm grasping the idea here, verse 12 says to prepare God's people. The Greek text would articulate it in this way. He says proston karatismon. He's using karatismon as a medical term which means to, most of the time in medical science, it simply meant to set the bone. In other words, if you were to break, say, your leg, the leg would not set itself. The physician would have to come along and set the bone. It's a very painful experience, but that's the only way that it will heal properly.
Right.
And if the bone is not set, you're going to have a problem. And that's the problem with people. This is what Paul is trying to nuance, if you will. He's trying to nuance the point that you have people who equip people. Wow. And so, how are people going to understand the difference between that which is spurious, that is wrong, as opposed to that which is right concerning the love of God? It's going to take gifted people.
Yeah.
And yes, it's true that since we've had so many people who have pretended and have been just like these wolves in sheep's clothing,
Sure.
taken advantage. They take advantage all the time of the common person. We need someone who will stand up. For instance, if we had someone who would actually stand up and say, listen, This is not about a theological agenda. This is not about defending God, but this is about being completely honest and completely transparent. What would life be like?
Right.
You know, my question a while ago was maybe along these lines. What would happen if we took and did this on Ustream? What if we took our school? What if I started teaching, and what if we brought in all the professors and started teaching? And those people who wanted to work towards a degree, for instance in India and other nations, they wanted to work towards a degree, they could do so. They could do the coursework. For the rest of the people, they could simply listen.
Sure.
At no charge. It wouldn't cost them anything. They could just simply listen and they could learn. This is not about politics. This is not about any of this. This is about concentrating on substantive talk and chat and learning processes and being extremely honest. What would happen?
Taking gifted people to equip other people.
Exactly. What if we did this? Would the entire paradigm of educating people change? Would the entire paradigm of how we are arriving from point A to point B and grasping the true love of God, would all of that change if that were done?
Yeah.
And so my point is, to answer his question, this book is not a self-help book.
Yeah. You know, if I can share a bit of an abstract analogy here. You know, in my life, I've discovered that God has given me certain gifts. I am gifted in the area of art, singing. I can write. I have some leadership skills. And growing up, I always, well, to some extent, I felt like everybody was just like this. You know, like the only reason that I could draw was because I had drawn a lot, and I had just gotten good, and so there wasn't anything special about me. I had just gotten interested in something and practiced, and you know, I struggled for a long time. You know, when I would you know, go very aggressively forward in something and just get really involved and sink my teeth into it, and some of the people around me would not do that so much, you know, and why aren't they coming along? Why aren't they being so aggressive? And one day the answer came to me that the reason why people do different things is because we have different gifts. If I go and I sink my teeth into something, I do that because God has given me a voracious desire for something, just like video work or art or something. And once I learn that, I can turn around and I can show that to somebody. I have a motivation within myself just to figure something out. Other people don't have that same motivation, but I can turn around, and there are people who want to know that kind of stuff, but their mind doesn't work like mine does. It's not, their mind isn't as twisted as mine. I'm a glutton for abuse. You know, I'll get in there and I'll just fail and people aren't like that. You know, a lot of people aren't. But I can turn around and teach other people. They want to learn that. You know, and so this is the beautiful relationships that God sets up. And so to bring it back to what we're talking about here, I can't read Greek and I can't read Hebrew. And before I met you, I wasn't nearly as good at even reading English. But you can read Hebrew and you can read Greek, and I can listen to you, and you just start squaring it all up and just start taking all the things that don't make any sense to me, and just start organizing them to where they do make sense and they fall into place. And so, to me, that makes all the sense in the world, because I'm not a glutton for abuse like you are. You know, you have been through the gauntlet when it comes to this sort of thing, and you have been through some grueling exercises just to figure this sort of thing out. And I could never go through that, but you have, and now you can turn around and you can teach me the things that you've learned. And even though I'm not willing to go through all that kind of abuse, that God hasn't given me that gift to do that, I'm certainly willing to listen to you and gather the knowledge that you have, and that benefits my life. If I turn around and try to do it myself, well, that would be all out of order because God hasn't gifted me in that area. So, to me, the big question here is, and I'm just speaking on a personal level, is how do we know, who's a good teacher and who's not? Well, first of all, I can personally testify that you're the best Bible teacher that I've ever met. Okay, but just speaking objectively and saying, how do we know that? How do we sort those things out? There's a huge red flag for me that I want to bring up here, and I find it in most, if not all, ministers of Protestantism, Catholicism, religion in general. And that is, ask them a question, a challenging one. And most of your ministers won't even let you do that. You stick to what they're teaching, you listen, and you don't ask questions. There is a smaller subset that will let you ask a question, but then ask another one. And keep asking questions. And don't stop asking questions. And I have not found, and I've been around for 30 plus years now, and I've met a lot of ministers in my life. I have not found a single minister outside of you. I'm not saying they're not out there. I'm just saying they're rare, and you are, guys like you are few and far between. Because all of the other teachers of theology, teachers of theology and of God and the Bible, I don't want to say all the other pastors because I know you don't like being called a pastor, but all of the other teachers of God, when I press and ask questions, they get uptight and eventually they just say, hey, I can't handle that, and that's not a true student of who God is. The day I started changing my mind was when I started promising people who are asking me questions that if I didn't know the answer, I would spend the time to find it. And when I really was honest about trying to find those answers, and that's when my mind began to start seeing that these things weren't making sense, and then you started straightening them all out for me. But most pastors I just have to say it, are not honest when it comes to the Bible. They have a job to do, and they have a church that they have to, and you were telling me this just the other day, they have a church that they have to shepherd. And if they don't do it in the way that's expected of them, they lose their job. And here we are, and we make this happen with the money out of our own pockets. And so, we're just doing this because we want to know who God is, and you're just and you're doing it for the same reason, and we're following you, and we don't answer to a system. Now, there needs to be a system in place, and we're in the process of establishing that system. But the systems that are already gargantuan out there, they don't make any sense. They cater to a deceptive theology.
I had a physician, and I'm very picky about physicians. You have some people who are not careful, and you have some, and I'm talking about physicians, we have some physicians who are extremely careful. This particular physician that I'm referencing, I'm not going to give his name, but he told me one day as I was there getting a checkup, he was looking at X, Y, and Z concerning me, and he said, Dr. Jones, he said, I'm fixing to leave my practice. I said, wow. I mean, we're not just patient, physician, we're friends. And I said, you're getting ready to leave your practice. Why? He said, the insurance programs have forced me into seeing 40 plus patients within a given amount of time per day in order to just make payroll. And he said, I'm not willing to do that. He said, when patients come in here, he said, I want to be able to help them. He said, I can't legitimately diagnose anyone if I'm going to use that kind of protocol. The point is, protocol means a lot. You can always tell whether a person is going to be intellectually honest with you or not based upon protocol. For instance, if you have a doctor that is a physician who is seeing 45 to 50 patients per day, there's no way that you can be diagnosed properly if, the medical doctor that I had is being truthful. Now, I don't know. I'm not a physician. The point is, when you look at protocol, when you look at someone who is financially invested, and I'm talking about any kind of discipline. For instance, if you have someone who is heavily invested in the Southern Baptist Church, do you really think that that person's going to leave that kind of box and answer a question that might go outside of that box? In other words, even our military recognizes that if you're in debt, for instance, if a young man is in debt for maybe $200,000 or $300,000 and he joins up and he wants to be an MP, they're not going to allow that. He's got to satisfy. I'm talking about just joining up to go to boot camp. He can't do that. Our military has enough sense to say no, because there is something there that's not right. Something's upside down, and we should applaud our military leaders who have set some benchmarks, who say, if you're financially in debt to that degree, to that extent, something's upside down. And if you're going to be an MP, you're going to be dealing with security matters. Now, we're not talking about being a general. We're simply talking about being an MP.
Right.
An MP is a very important job. Military, police. If you're going to be involved in any kind of security, just to make that mark right there, which is vitally important to our nation's, security, just to get to that benchmark right there, you can't be in debt. Why? Because the propensity is you might steal. So they know that a lot of schools will say, well, if you're in debt, there's going to be maybe a problem here or there, and that's the point. The point is you need to examine someone's protocol. If someone, for instance, wants to suggest to you, oh, I am this one who teaches the gospel, if they are heavily invested in a defense of a particular theology, if they have to defend a certain kind of theology, there's no way that you're going to get an honest answer from them. And this is why I think that we have to walk away from church, because if a person is a priest, he can't deny his theology. If a person is a Pentecostal, a Protestant, all Protestants have to admit to a certain kind of theology or they're just not going to make it. You can't get the average pastor to simply be objective about these particular kinds of concerns. You can't, for instance, the person that you rattled yesterday, he has his doctorate. Wow.
You can make me laugh.
And you rattled him. I'm impressed, because here you are, an artist, one who does video, and you rattled this man who is extremely well educated in theology, but it's not the kind of theology that's not without bias, and you crippled him that quick and kept him crippled, and he could not answer any of your questions. You silenced him.
Sure.
And the reason that you silenced him, it's because he is a pastor, and if he were to crawl outside of that box and try to be honest with you, he would lose his congregation, his job, etc. And so that kind of person can't be trusted.
Yes.
That's unfortunate.
But there's 2 points there. Number one, the point that you're making about the person I was debating is a really good one. But also that I'm not a Bible translator. I don't read the original languages. I can enunciate some Greek, but I've been sitting under your teaching for years, and it's not that I've learned to be a parrot. That's not. This is not. Well, let's learn a new model of wrestling with this superstition. You're giving your students the ability to think through even the English and discern when something smells funny. You know what I'm saying? And to start asking good questions. A good place to begin as a good student is to know the right questions to ask. And most people don't even know the right questions to ask. I was thinking this morning how there are people in this world that are so gifted, like you in Bible translation, or Eric Clapton with the guitar, and just to be able to spend an hour with a person like that is an incredible blessing. But sometimes you have to know the right questions to ask, because if it's just an hour that you have, it may just be buying them a hamburger. So as a good student, you really need to take the first step of understanding the right questions to ask. And Roy's asking some great questions.
Right.
You can see it's obvious that he's wanting to rise from where he's currently at. And there are a lot of people out there that talk about, I want to know God. I want to, they lift their hands, they close their eyes. But really all they're wanting is a feeling. The mark of a good student is the one who's struggling to ask the right questions. And really, that's about all that I did with the theologian that I spoke with yesterday. Is I just began to ask him all the right questions. And I made a few arguments, but the thing that stopped the argument was when I asked the questions that he couldn't answer. He was making a comment about how the Old Testament is summed up in love, and that Jesus Christ and the God of the Old Testament are one and the same God. And I just showed him the account where the Old Testament God killed a man who was gathering firewood, but Jesus spared an adulteress. I said, now let's compare these two stories. Is adultery a worse crime than gathering firewood, or is it a greater crime? And so the God over here killed a guy who was just gathering firewood, but over here Jesus spared somebody who was caught in adultery. Does this match up? Does the character of this God match the character of this God? Does asking that question lean credence to your assumption that they're the same God, or does it cast doubt on it? And that was just one of the questions, and I just began throwing question after question after question at him, and he never came back. I mean, he may eventually, but a lot of people learn a model of theology, and it only works within their box. And when somebody from another box comes over and they start putting their boxes together, it just starts going around and around in this circular argument that never ends, and it's futile it's usually futile for two Christians who believe two different things to get together and argue about anything. You're not going to accomplish anything by that. But when you finally get to a place to where you know how to ask effective questions and come to effective conclusions, that's when it's not a debate anymore. I mean, I told this guy 3/4 of the way, and I was probably getting a little cocky, but I told him that his theology was defeated before he even began, and I knew that because the abilities that you've given me as a student in the areas of logic and just thinking things through, I find with great assurance that it doesn't matter who is out there in the areas of Protestantism, Catholicism, or any of this religion based on mythology, unless there's some fast-talking con artist, I don't find that they're going to be much of a challenge. You just have to ask the right questions, and they might find a way to walk away and save some face, but they're not going to come back.
I agree. One of the fascinating things that I think that you really brought up that I really liked about that spill that you went on there.
It lasted a while. Sorry about that.
I really liked the idea of Eric Clapton. He plays a Fender Stratocaster, and he plays well. But we have Rick here, who is actually much better than Eric Clapton. And one of these days, we're going to get him on stage
Come on up here
and allow him to get up here and, you know, just really kick back and just amaze us. And that would be nice.
Yeah, he is fantastic.
And I'm looking for someone who can amaze us as much on the bass guitar. That would be nice.
Yeah.
But, yeah, you've made some good points.
Well, I hope that answered your question, Roy. I mean, I don't think that it's a mystery that if you asked me how you're going to tell the difference, spend some time under the right teacher, and you're certainly in the right place. And so stick around. We've got a long way to go and a lot more shows to do. And
let me add this concerning Roy's question. Now, we are going to publish many things, including a better translation. And this is not based upon synthetic models. This would be based upon a fluency model of translation, and that's much better for the English-only student. And this gives an English-only student the ability to grasp, you know, the context rather than just some terms. And it's not wooden, it's not awkward, but it rolls and flows just like people utilizing a language. And so it's extremely language smart, and that will be out in a few years. But even when it comes out, it still needs to be placed in a workable context, because we do not need to put a period at the, you know, we never need to say, oh, I've learned something, period. What we need to do is we need to put a comma there and say, you know, I'm learning, comma, and I'm going to continue, comma, and I'm going to continue, comma. That's the idea. Let's not park it. Let's not park our minds. Let's keep thinking.
Yeah. So before we end this this segment, I just want to mention this morning I talked about how you can help us by clicking that donate button on our website. I also want to mention one other thing, that we really could use your help in the area of just spreading the word. Dr. Jones and Rhonda have a Facebook page. They're at Kaine Diatheke. We don't even have the right titling for that we can put up for you, but it's Kaine, and Diatheke is Diatheke. I spelled that right, didn't I?
I wasn't listening.
Yeah.
I was getting out my rock for circumcision tonight.
Okay. Well, I'm not ready for that. So Kaine Diatheke is the English transliteration for New Covenant. If you search for that on Facebook, friend their page, friend my page. I'm Joey Livingston. Look me up. I'll friend you back, and we get involved in some really interesting discussions on Facebook. And share our link with the people that you know. Let them know so that they can watch the show too. I mean, we can use all the help that we can get. So if you're enjoying the show, and if it's helping you think through some things, as it certainly should be, then pay it forward by sharing with somebody else so that they can enjoy what you're enjoying too. And we would really appreciate it. So with that, we'll be back at 6:50. We're having a discussion. Are you having a discussion with Rhonda? Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. So we'll see you then.